Hi, this is Mr. Fernandez, coming at you from spring break to talk to you a little bit about the year 1968. This is a classic turning point issue or question, and I want to explore it together with you. The the way to get started here is to think about this in the form of an LEQ prompt that looks something like this. Evaluate the extent to which 1968 marked a turning point in American politics. Now, here's the deal. The, the kind of classic story, the conventional narrative of the 1960s and 1970s goes a little bit like this. It goes. It posits that the 1960s were the heyday of liberalism, the apex, the high point, the moment in time when the United States politics were at their most liberal. And then it says that the 1970s, usually, the story goes, is the conservative backlash. Now, again, this is the conventional narrative. What I want to do today is I'd like to give you some evidence to help you decide for yourself whether this is true. Whether that is the 60s were super liberal and the 70s were super conservative, with 1968 being the big turning point between liberalism and conservatism. Before we do that, let's define our terms a little bit. Liberal, of course, in the case of liberal politics in the United States, means having a strong faith in government to solve problems. That suggests the idea, the belief that the government is here to alleviate social problems, especially those born out of capitalism. And conservatives in the American political context, that means that the belief in personal responsibility, in having a government that doesn't do too much, that does not intervene in people's lives to any great extent, to allow for the free market, capitalism, to do its job. It usually is aligned with social conservatism as well, and this belief in a strong national defense. So again, let's examine the evidence then. Were the 1960s an era of liberal politics, and the 1970s an era of conservative politics, and was 1968 the point where all of that changed, where things went from liberal to conservative? So let's have a look at the 2 decades, and as you go along, kind of jot down some notes about whether or not to help you amass evidence to answer this question. The first kind of big piece of evidence is Lyndon Johnson. Now, Lyndon Johnson was the vice president under John F. Kennedy. He became the president when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and he served the rest of John F. Kennedy's term. He was a liberal Democrat from Texas, a former senator, and in 1964, Johnson gave a big speech. And in that speech, he outlined what came to be known as his Great Society proposal. The Great Society, under Lyndon Johnson, was a series of laws passed by the Congress, the Democratic Congress, signed by Johnson, that achieved goals set out by Johnson that included making America a society of not only affluence, but also of fairness and justice. And that included, for him, economic justice. So, for example, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned segregation. He didn't do this, or he was criticized, let's say, for doing this reluctantly, but he did finally come around to supporting the African American civil rights movement, even though it meant losing the support of a lot of white Democrats in the South, which is one of the reasons why he was always kind of reluctant to go too far, too quickly in this arena. He also signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This was after the Selma to Montgomery March that ended in violence that you learned about in previous days. He also, well, let's skip that. He also signed the Immigration Act of 1965. This was a major, a landmark immigration law that totally undid the last law that you guys learned about from the 1920s, the National Origins Act. If you recall, that law was all about setting quotas for immigration from different countries, prioritizing Western and Northern Europeans, and totally banning Asians from coming to this country. Now, that law was chipped away at a little bit at a time over the 40s and 50s during the Cold War, but in 1965, Johnson and the Democrats in Congress utterly replaced it with a new way of approaching immigration that gave preference to relatives of U.S. residents and foreigners with useful skills, no matter where they were, and that evenly distributed the per-country cap. So that is, all the countries of the world were given whatchamacallit, a cap on the number of immigrants that can come from there, but the number was made even across all of the world. So no longer would there be a preference for Northern and Western Europeans, but now people from all over the world would be allowed to come into the United States as long as they met certain criteria. And of course, this was there was a general limit on immigration that still remained, of course. So as you can see, that had a huge effect, the Immigration Act of 1965, on the sources of immigration to the U.S., which changed from European primarily to Asian and Latin American overwhelmingly after the 1960s. Johnson's Great Society also was about attacking poverty in the United States. Poverty became a big issue thanks to Michael Harrington, a social democrat, a liberal, very, very liberal Democrat, who published a book called The Other America in 1962, which he said showed that an excessively high number of Americans still lived in poverty, despite an amazing growth in the economy over the last 2 decades. As a result of that new attention being paid to poverty, Lyndon Johnson and the Democrats in Congress passed a whole number of laws that fell under the umbrella term of the War on Poverty. This war on poverty included things like the Head Start program for low-income children to get early childhood education, to the food stamp program, an expanded version of the food stamp program that had begun in the 1930s, but perhaps most importantly, the Medicaid and the Medicare programs. Medicare is a health insurance program for all elderly Americans, while Medicaid is a health insurance program for low-income Americans. Both were passed in the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson, and both were intended to alleviate the growing cost of healthcare that many Americans faced, especially people with low incomes. Older people generally were very often in and continue to be very often low income. With Social Security and Medicare, that kind of alleviates that problem. Whereas low-income people struggled with health insurance and health care, and Medicaid came to their rescue. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act was also a landmark bill that expanded the role of the federal government in public schools. Up to that point, state and local governments were almost 100% responsible for schools, public schools. Here you have the federal government guaranteeing aid, especially to schools in high poverty areas. Today, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act still provides enormous amounts of funding, especially for public schools that serve a lot of low-income children. So you can see the war on poverty had a pretty immediate effect on the poverty rate, which declined from in the 1960s and stayed pretty much the same ever since. It also had an enormous effect on spending. The Great Society programs like Medicare and Medicaid, in particular, were led to enormous increases in spending on the part of the federal government. Today, the Medicare and Medicaid programs account for 25% of the federal budget. Some of these non-defense discretionary programs include food stamps and welfare, what was called back then aid to families with dependent children, and other programs that were expanded under Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. So as you can see, there was a huge increase in federal power, in the role of the federal government in people's lives, and of course in federal spending. All of that, of course, led to great criticism on the part of a lot of people, including especially conservatives. For many, the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's vast expansion of federal power, was the New Deal gone crazy, and stretched the federal government's budget way too much. This was, of course, especially in light of the fact that the federal government was spending already a ton of money in the Vietnam War. The Great Society added to the huge expense of the expenses that the federal government was assuming, and many saw this as way too much on the part of the federal government. Many conservatives were concerned that the federal government was growing way too powerful, getting way too into people's lives, disincentivizing work by providing for social welfare programs, etc., etc. But it wasn't just the Congress and the President that were embracing liberalism in the 1960s. It was also the Supreme Court, famously. In the 1960s, Chief Justice Earl Warren, a liberal justice, perhaps the most liberal or one of the most liberal Chief Justices we've had, ushered in an era of liberalism in the Supreme Court. In a number of landmark cases, you can see that the Supreme Court embraced liberal politics. For example, in the arena of criminal justice, the Supreme Court ruled in Miranda versus Arizona that all defendants must be informed of their right to remain silent. Otherwise, any evidence or confessions made by those people would be disregarded in a court. Under Gideon versus Wainwright, the Supreme Court ruled that people who can't afford lawyers must be provided with lawyers when they're accused of committing a crime. So you can see there that the Supreme Court is growing the protections for the most vulnerable people, people who are accused of crimes, and increasing their protection under the U.S. Constitution. At the same time, the U.S. Supreme Court under Earl Warren also provided for huge increases in the right to privacy. In Griswold versus Connecticut, for example, the Supreme Court ruled that state governments could not ban contraception or the publication of material promoting contraception, like condoms and birth control pills. In the Engel versus Vitale case, the Supreme Court said that schools cannot require prayer in public schools. All of this again ushered in a very leftward shift in the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, a lot of this stuff already in the middle of the 1960s was causing a lot of apprehension on the part of conservatives. One of those, one moment when you see a kind of flashpoint of criticism of all of this liberal stuff going on in the 1960s was in the campaign of 1964. During that campaign, a very conservative senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater, achieved the nomination for the Republican Party, and he ran against Lyndon Johnson in 1964, the Democrat. Goldwater ran on a platform of utter rejection of the Great Society. He advocated for a complete and total repeal of most New Deal era programs and most Great Society and War on Poverty programs. He lost, winning the votes only of some southern states and his home state of Arizona. But the conservative kind of backlash against the Great Society would not go away and would build and build and build throughout the 1960s. So that brings us to 1968. The turning point in question here. 68 was indeed a crazy election year. There was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated, leading to widespread rioting in urban areas across the country. It was also the year that a Democratic presidential candidate, John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was assassinated as well. Here he is, taking his last dying breath. It was also the year that the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, that's the convention that held every 4 years, to decide who was going to be the nominee for the Democrats for president. The Republicans have their own convention every 4 years as well. That year, the convention was insane. This was in the middle of the Vietnam War era. This was when the student protest movement, the anti-war movement, was at its peak. And thousands and thousands and thousands of protesters who were opposed to the Vietnam War gathered at the convention. The result of that of the huge protests, along with the ginormous police presence in 1968, was a huge mess outside of the Democratic National Convention. Eventually, the protesters and police clashed for hours and hours and hours, and then days and days and days, as all of America and all of the world watched these riots between protesters and the police continued. That same year, Governor George Wallace of Alabama, an unabashed segregationist, runs for president as an independent candidate. And his basic message as a presidential candidate is that the country has been going crazy. He pointed to the Democratic National Convention of 1968, the assassinations of major political figures, the riots in urban areas that you saw after the assassination of Martin Luther King, but also throughout the middle of the 1960s that you already learned about. He argued that America had been taken over by the hippies, by the anti-war protesters, by all the crazies, and that the mainstream people like him, the regular, plain old conservative people, were being drowned out by these liberal, fanatic voices from the 1960s. But more than anybody was this guy, Richard Nixon, in 1968, who kind of captured the imagination and the support of conservatives as he ran for the Republican nomination, got it, and then ran for campaign for president. Nixon's candidacy rested on what he called on a platform of law and order. He said that America was in chaos, violence on the streets, the hippies everywhere, blacks rioting in urban areas, assassinations, all that other stuff was an indication that America was in decline. America was a mess, and what we needed was a refocus on law and order. The civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the anti-war movement, all of the youth counterculture movement, all of this had gone too far. America needed to return to law and order, he said. And he said that he represented the silent majority of people, those who did not protest or use drugs or go to Woodstock or riot in the streets. Those people, he said, were the majority, and they were being drowned out. They weren't being heard. And he said, I am your champion. I am the champion of the silent majority. And Nixon won the election in 1968. And essentially, it led to a huge shift in politics in the United States. 1968 saw the beginning of the end of the old New Deal coalition. What begins to happen is that white Southern Democrats begin losing their support for the Democratic Party. Remember that the Democratic Party was the party that ultimately ended up embracing civil rights legislation. The Democratic Party was the party of Lyndon Johnson. The Democratic Party was the party of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Democratic Party was the party of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Democratic Party was doing a lot to promote the rights of African Americans. And white Southerners began to leave the Democratic Party at the end of the decade, finding a home in Nixon's Republican Party. Beginning in 1968, but moving into the 1970s and 1980s, this becomes a long-term trend. Middle-class voters in the growing Sun Belt, for example, in places like Phoenix and Houston, begin to vote Republican as well, focusing on the Republican message of low-tax economic policies, small government, patriotism, and traditional values, all things that they said had been betrayed in the 1960s. And here you can see it. Blue is the percentage of people who vote Democratic. Red is the percentage of people who vote Republican. And you can see here that the 1970s is kind of like the beginning of the end for this New Deal coalition. The number of people who vote Democratic goes down. The number of people who vote Republican goes up. And gradually by the 1980s, you can see that those lines kind of converge. And the Democrats lose their huge advantage among voters that started with the 1930s, ended with the 1960s and 1970s. Let's skip that. You can see this major shift as well in the Electoral College map. Here you have in 1960 the solid South, the blue South, always voting Democratic. Here you have in 1988, that's gone, except for a few black and urban counties in the South. By 1988, the shift is complete. The South has become red, and that continues into today. The Nixon era in the 1970s does in fact represent a pretty strong reaction to the civil rights movement, and to the movement as it became more and more militant in the middle of the 1960s. Whites in all around the country, not just in the South, including in northern areas, like in cities like Boston, in Chicago, and in more liberal southern cities like Charleston, you got a backlash against the civil rights movement. One of the efforts that were being made in the 1960s and 1970s was to desegregate schools, was to bus in black kids from black neighborhoods into white schools and vice versa, to try to balance out the racial imbalance in segregated public schools. In the 1970s, you see a very strong reaction to this among white voters. The anti-busing movement really rises up under Nixon in the 1970s. Here's an anti-busing protest. The protesters literally jabbing a guy in the stomach with the flag. And this anti-busing movement is encouraged in a way by Nixon in a pretty strong way, because Nixon and the Republicans are starting to realize something. They're starting to realize that they can win the support of Southern whites away from the Democrats, something that was unheard of in years past. Remember, the Democrats had been voting for the Republican Party for 130 years since for the Democratic Party for 130 years since the 1830s under Jackson. And now you have a moment of truth for the Republican Party. They can get the support of white Southerners and use that to build a winning coalition that will get them to win more and more national elections. Nixon adopts what comes to be called the Southern strategy to appeal to white Democratic voters in the South. That included things like opposing busing, nominating more conservative Southerners to the Supreme Court, and talking about things like states' rights. Now, states' rights was code. It really was. It was code for, we're going to stop pushing for black civil rights. The federal government will stop intervening in southern states. Up to that point, the federal government was the one that was pushing for civil rights, starting with the Supreme Court's ruling in the Brown versus Board of Education case, for example, moving on into the use of federal troops in the Little Rock, in the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, and of course into the 1960s with the civil rights laws of 1964 and 1965. Southerners always greeted this with animosity, saying that this was federalism gone awry. The federal government was putting its nose into the affairs that were rightfully belonged to the states and the state governments. Nixon says, I'm going to reverse that trend. I'm going to ease up on federal intervention in the South. I'm going to respect states' rights. I'll skip that. At the same time that all this is going on, in the 1960s and 1970s, you get slowly a religious revival that is in many ways a reaction to what's happening in the 1960s. Remember that people in the 1960s was all about the counterculture, hippies, drug use, women becoming liberated, the sexual revolution. All of this was very concerning to traditional social conservatives, especially strong Christian religionists, and you start getting the growth of a fundamentalist movement. This movement really draws on the technology of television. You get televangelism becomes a word in the 1960s and 1970s, especially in the 1970s, with people like Pat Robertson and Oral Roberts, who kind of go on TV and talk about the moral decay of the 60s and 70s. Jerry Falwell, pictured here, founds what comes to be known as the Moral Majority Organization, and very, very explicitly links social conservatism to and a reaction to the liberal decay, the moral decay of the 1960s, and links it to the Republican Party, and begins to raise funds for Republican political campaigns, in the hopes that those political campaigns will support a more traditional, conservative, more Christian, fundamentalist Christian agenda. The two things really, really angered these people in the 60s and 70s. One was, of course, the case of Engel versus Vitale that I already talked about. The other was the Roe versus Wade decision by the Supreme Court, which said that abortion could not be outlawed by state governments. Fundamentalist Christians, evangelical Christians, believed that abortion was a violation of Christian tenets, and allowing it to happen at all, they felt was immoral. And here you have the government, the Supreme Court, ruling that states cannot ban it. This really galvanized social conservatives who were welcomed into the Republican Party in the 1970s and 1980s. Along with that, some of the things that happened in the 1970s also can be said to have fed into conservative, anti-government sentiment. One of those things is the Vietnam War. Johnson lost his bid for well, actually, he didn't run for president in 1968. The Democrats lost their bid for the presidency in 1968. Richard Nixon won, and he continued the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon, he continued to escalate the Vietnam War, and hold on a second. Hi, sweetie. Oh, cool. Can you give me 10 more minutes, and then I'll be all done. Okay. I'm gonna sit outside and finish this because I don't know how to stop it. Okay. And then I'll be all done, sweetie. Anyway, that was my little girl. All right. Nixon continued the Vietnam War, but was notorious for lying a lot, for engaging in secret campaigns in neighboring countries as a way to try to speed up the end of the war, which did come. America did not achieve its goals in Vietnam, but it came at a cost. The end of the war did. It came at a cost to trust in government. Americans, by the 1970s, were fed up with how powerful the military establishment had become, and the president's military powers had become in the 1960s, especially as a result of, during the Cold War, but especially as a result of the Vietnam War. And in 1973, the federal government, the Congress, passed the War Powers Act. Nixon vetoed it, but Congress was able to override his veto, and the War Powers Act really limits the power of the federal government, rather the power of the president to wage war without congressional approval. By the way, the War Powers Act has always been ignored by every single president, and every single Congress has refused to enforce its stipulations. But that's another story. Nixon, for many, betrayed the anti-communist, the anti-communism of conservatism by reaching out to China. Nixon was the first president to visit China since it fell to communism in the 1940s. A huge shift in American policy. Many conservatives thought this was a betrayal of anti-communism, and turned on Nixon in many ways. Nixon also signed an arms treaty with the Soviet Union. Another, for many conservatives, another betrayal of anti-communism and the goals of the Cold War. But and Nixon had a big problem with the economy. Under Nixon and then those who followed him, the post-World War II prosperity seemed to come to an end. America during the 1970s suffered from pretty slow economic growth, as well as huge problems with prices. Most importantly, because of an oil crisis in the 1970s that led to higher and higher prices. This led to a lot of people kind of becoming disillusioned with the power of with the ability of the government to kind of solve American problems. Under Richard Nixon, the environmental movement saw some of its greatest, earliest achievements. The environmental movement did begin in the 1960s. It began with Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring that became a bestseller in 1962. Silent Spring was about all the chemicals that were being used in farming. Silent Spring refers to the death of birds and other and insects that during the spring were supposed to come out and make all kinds of noise and stuff, but because of these chemicals were being killed. And she said that these chemicals were poisoning not just the wildlife but also Americans. It took a little while for the environmental movement to kind of pick up steam, but by 1970, under Nixon, it saw some pretty big successes. The Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, and Nixon helped create the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970 to oversee government efforts to improve the environment. The Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, giving the government the power to pass regulations that led to cleaner waterways like rivers and lakes and stuff. The Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973. I bet you Nixon believed that he might become known as the environmental president. But that wasn't to be. Instead, Nixon became known as the dude who betrayed America and had to resign in shame as a result of the Watergate scandal, wherein Nixon apparently, along with his political cronies, his buddies, advisors, and whatnot in the White House, broke into the Democratic Party's headquarters in Watergate, an office complex in Washington, D.C., and then tried to hide that they had done that, along with a bunch of other kind of unsavory things that they had done to try to win elections in 1972. Nixon also did what he could, apparently, to get the Justice Department to stop investigating or to lead them away from Nixon and his close allies. All of this was exposed by Washington Post reporters in 1973 and 1974, and finally the evidence amassed against Nixon just grew to be too great, and Nixon saw the writing on the wall. He realized that he would likely be impeached, so he resigned. Gerald Ford became president, by the way, and pardoned Nixon. But we can skip all that and go straight to the Jimmy Carter presidency. A Democrat, a liberal Democrat, in the 1970s, Jimmy Carter did a lot to grow the conservative movement in response to what are seen as some of his failures as president. Jimmy Carter, under Jimmy Carter, the Iranian Revolution happened. And you may have seen the movie Argo about the Iranian hostage crisis. American embassy workers were taken hostage in Iran for many, many months, and Jimmy Carter was unable to stop that or to end the crisis. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan in Jimmy Carter's presidency, and many viewed this as kind of Jimmy Carter allowing the Soviets to expand their power. As Jimmy Carter not being anti-communist enough, as not being a tough enough Cold Warrior. And trust in the federal government truly does plummet in the 1970s. It plummets, meaning like the percentage of people who say they trust the government just falls tremendously. Of course, you know that conservatives are the ones that are most likely to distrust the government. And the number of people who distrust the government grows tremendously in the 1970s. This is a result of all the stuff that was happening in the 70s, from Watergate, of course, to the economic crisis of the 70s, to the many missteps of the Carter administration, and on and on. So that by 1980, you saw the election of one of the most conservative presidents in the United States history, Ronald Reagan. That's for another day. So anyway, back to the original question. Did 1968 mark a turning point in American politics? Well, hopefully you've seen enough now to answer that question for yourself. You can now turn to the assignment, and I'll see you in class.